There are lots of shows that have the potential to be really good, but end up being handicapped simply by electing to be a certain genre. Ecchi and harem, two genres that go together like toilet paper in your butthole, are just some of those genres. Fortunately, this also means you are setting the bar extremely low for yourself, which means expectations are low, so nobody expects much at all. Thus, the surprise is all the greater when you show that you actually do have some idea what the concepts of story and characters mean. And that's the situation Kore wa Zanbe Desu ka is in. The only reason I even touched the show is because a large number of positive reviews that stated that it was better than most of the competition when it comes to ecchi and harem. It didn't take much experience in these genres for me to deem shows like these to be generic shit wish fulfillment for otaku to fap to, and every season just has to have at least a few of them for that purpose, just because they sell. But surprisingly enough, there are shows in this vein that don't just have talking cardboard for characters, that don't have glue-eating monkeys writing the story, that aren't written assuming you think with your dick. In my experience, there are only two shows that aren't complete garbage in the ecchi and harem genre. The first I saw was Shuffle, the other is Kore wa Zombie. You can find the general synopsis anywhere, so I won't touch too much on it. All I'll say is that a bunch of girls end up living with Ayumu, and this sets up a venue for a bunch of shenanigans to ensue. Now, like I said, the characters in general are a step above what you normally get in ecchi harem. The girls, surprisingly enough, aren't just throwing themselves in the protagonist's lap for no reason whatsoever, like what happens in most of these shows. The protagonist isn't a complete beta fuck nugget and is actually tolerable. However, we do have Haruna, a tsundere loli, who isn't distinguishable from the typical carbon copy tsunderes, aside from the fact that she is of the more violent variety, beating Ayumu's face in because he almost kissed her in her own dream, and bullshit like that. Haruna doesn't have much going on in the dere department, making her one of the majority of intolerable tsunderes. Fangs like she has are supposed to be there for cute factor, but in her case, they only ended up making her look more evil. Sarah is basically a bitchy bitch for the sake of being a bitch. A bitchy pie hole attached to a pair of bloated watermelons whose basic speech patterns consist of calling Ayumu an insect and a piece of shit, and calling him sick when those inevitable accidental pervert moments happen. Her banter gets really old really fast, and it's hard not to want to slap her for the lack of logic that surrounds most of her verbal abuse. She's just another one of those top-heavy girls who's there for the oversized tata service, even though those things are way too fucking huge, and if you think they're sexy, you're retarded. There is such a thing as too big. Anyway, those two bitches hurt the character department pretty hard by themselves, to the point of causing me to get extremely angry most of the time. Luckily, we have Yu, the resident emotionless girl around whom most of the story's events revolve. Her presence alone basically saves the character department. Even without my bias towards emotionless girls, she's easily the best character in the show, with the most hidden depth, emotion, and development. Her behavior and mannerisms are fascinating, and the reason why she basically has to act emotionless is pretty good as well. It's also nice that she has to wear that armor, because it helps protect her from being sexualized in those moments of fan service, like bath scenes that are standard fare for ecchis. The rest of the characters are just okay, with a typical severely lopsided girl-to-guy ratio. They're generally fun and mostly significant, despite being mostly flat. But I will say Ariel is by far the most interesting and fun of them. I wish we had gotten more of her. But it's not fucking around with dumb bullshit. The story is actually pretty decent. The fact that it even has a continuous, overarching, cohesive one is nearly unheard of in ecchi harems. It could have spent more time focusing on it though, but if it had, there wouldn't have been enough time for important things like accidental pervert moments and panty shots. The writers clearly decided that full focus on the story would have been far too much work, so they elected to fart around about 80% of the show with the usual stuff you can find in most ecchis. They include zombies, vampires, and maso shoujo, mostly for the sake of just having those things, but in some ways, they do have interesting takes on these things, making it seem more like they had a plan going on instead of just going for rule of cool. Regardless, I'm still surprised by how much they did focus on important things. There's actually some good drama and emotional pull going on too, still mostly revolving around Yu and her conflict with the man from her past. The art and animation are honestly much better than a show of this strain deserves, and it's undoubtedly the best part of the show. It's made all the more surprising by the fact that it's Studio Dean that produced it. Special effects that go into the action sequences are actually superb, and the directional and ambient lighting, at times, are comparable to PA Works, one of the most godly animation studios in the industry. The opening and ending themes are surprisingly catchy. The soundtrack is good where it counts, but not particularly outstanding. The voice acting is standard fare. No one performance really stands out. Although the seiyuu for Haruna and Sarah are really good at making their characters colossal because that's what they are. One of the reasons the show stands above the rest in its class is that the ecchi and harem aspects are very light. There is actually a surprisingly small amount of fan service and pervert moments when you consider the fact that it's an ecchi, and the girls don't just randomly show interest in the protagonist immediately after meeting him, making his growing harem at least a little bit believable. There's actually a good amount of genuinely funny moments, but many of the times that involve Ayumu abuse that are played for comedy just make me angry. I hate it when writers try to make the abuse of a main character a basis for comedy, because it basically doesn't give the guy a chance to act like a real person and not just a punching bag. Besides, what else is the butt monkey there for? So as a critic, I can only give this show a 5 out of 10. But, as it stands alone in the ecchi harem scene, it's easily a god, netting it a 10 out of 10, at least for those genres. The second season, whose title you get simply by adding "of the dead" to the end of the title, was quite the disappointment. It becomes obvious after the first few episodes that the decent story the first season possessed has been completely forgotten in favor of leaning towards hard ecchi and harem, and the only story only really tries to rear its head towards the end of the show, but by then, it's too late. We get a new token loli because the pedophiles were feeling left out, and Haruno is too old for them. But don't worry guys, she's actually several hundred years old, so it's okay to fap too. Fucking retarded. There's some hoye for people with that. Fucking yeah. Ayamu gets abused even more this season, and that's pretty much where most of the comedy is supposed to come from. His harem inexplicably grows larger and larger, forsaking logic and characterization in favor of a stab at generic, mindless entertainment. The OVAs are actually quite funny though. Not much to say about them other than Ayamu's ass. That is all. I actually really recommend Season 1, even if you aren't an ecchi or harem fan, and especially if you are, because it really is the best of them all. I also recommend the OVAs, because they're really funny, but Season 2 is a massive letdown, and simply shouldn't be bothered with at all, unless you were only watching the show for huge tatas and shit in the first place. And if that's the case, all the words I just said were wasted on you anyway.